10 days. That's all it took for the world to realize there would be no turning back, no diplomatic miracle, no last-minute salvation from the abyss that had opened beneath civilization itself. September 11th, 1939, dawned over a Poland already drowning in fire and steel. And as the sun rose on September 20th, the nation that had stood defiant for centuries lay broken, divided, and betrayed by powers both east and west, while the great democracies of Europe watched with clenched fists and heavy hearts, knowing they had declared war but were not yet ready to fight it. These 10 days would not only seal Poland's fate, but would establish the brutal template for a new kind of warfare that would consume the world for 6 years, claim tens of millions of lives, and forever change the meaning of human conflict. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany had unleashed Operation Fallweiss, sending over 1.5 million German troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashing across Poland's borders in what would become known as Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, a devastating combination of rapid armored thrusts, tactical air superiority, and psychological terror that shattered traditional military doctrine. Britain and France, bound by treaty obligations to Poland, had issued ultimatums to Hitler demanding German withdrawal, and when those ultimatums expired unanswered on September 3rd, both nations declared war on Germany, transforming what might have been a regional conflict into a European war with global implications. But here's the terrible truth that haunted those 10 days in September. Declaring war and waging war are two entirely different things, and while Polish soldiers fought with extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds, the promised relief from the West never came. The bombers that were supposed to strike German industry remained grounded, and the great French army that was supposed to launch a major offensive into Germany from the West instead sat behind the Maginot Line, waiting, watching, hesitating. By September 11th, the German advance had achieved breakthroughs that military analysts thought impossible. The Polish Pomorsy army had been encircled and was fighting desperately to break out. Warsaw was under aerial bombardment that killed thousands of civilians and set entire neighborhoods ablaze. And German panzer divisions were racing deep into Polish territory, creating pockets of surrounded Polish forces that were being systematically destroyed. The Luftwaffe owned the skies, and Hermann Göring's airmen were not just targeting military installations, but were deliberately bombing civilian areas, refugee columns, and even clearly marked hospitals, establishing a pattern of total war that would characterize the entire conflict. Polish Air Force fighters, though outnumbered and flying obsolete aircraft, fought with suicidal bravery, and Polish pilots would shoot down hundreds of German aircraft during the campaign. But they were simply overwhelmed by numbers, technology, and the relentless pace of the German assault. On September 12th, Polish forces launched a desperate counterattack along the Bzura River, the largest Polish offensive operation of the campaign, where General Tadeusz Kuczeba's Poznan army and General Juliusz Romel's Lodz army struck at the exposed flank of the German 8th Army, achieving initial success that sent shockwaves through German command and briefly threatened to disrupt the entire invasion plan. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed possible that Polish determination might slow the German juggernaut, that the gap in technology and numbers might be overcome by courage and tactical skill. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. The German response was swift and brutal. Air power was concentrated against the Polish offensive, supply lines were interdicted, and German armored reserves were rushed to contain and then crush the Polish thrust, transforming what began as a promising counterattack into yet another encirclement, another desperate last stand, another addition to the growing list of Polish tragedies. September 14 brought news that sent tremors through every Polish heart. Still beating with hope, the German forces had reached the outskirts of Warsaw, and the capital itself was now under direct assault. its streets filled with refugees, its buildings scarred by bombs, its defenders preparing for house-to-house fighting against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Stefan Starzyński, the mayor of Warsaw, became the voice of Polish resistance, broadcasting daily radio messages that mixed practical instructions for defense with passionate appeals to Polish pride and honor, telling his people that we will fight for every street, every house, every stone, even as German artillery began to systematically pulverize the city. The siege of Warsaw would become one of the defining moments of the September campaign, a symbol of Polish determination to resist even when resistance seemed futile, and the civilian population of the capital, having experienced German bombing for 2 weeks, now faced the prospect of urban warfare that would turn their homes into battlefields and their children into casualties of a conflict they never chose. But while the world's attention focused on Warsaw's agony, something far more sinister was unfolding in the shadows of diplomacy and secret agreements, something that would transform Poland's desperate fight into a complete catastrophe. Since August 23, 1939, when Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov signed the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact in Moscow, there had been a secret protocol hidden from the world that divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence and essentially sentenced Poland to death by partition. On September 17, 1939, while Polish forces were still fighting desperately against the Germans, still hoping that somehow they might hold out until Western relief arrived, still believing that their Soviet neighbor would remain neutral or perhaps even provide some humanitarian assistance, the Red Army crossed Poland's eastern border with overwhelming force, opening a second front that made Poland's situation absolutely hopeless. Over 800,000 Soviet troops, with thousands of tanks and aircraft, poured across a border that was defended by only lightly armed border guards and scattered Polish units that had been pulled west to fight the Germans and the Soviet invasion. Dressed up in propaganda as a mission to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, was in reality a cynical land grab that had been coordinated with the Nazis and that sealed Poland's fate as surely as any German panzer thrust. The Polish government, which had evacuated Warsaw on September 6th and was now in Romania, received the news of the Soviet invasion with shock and despair. They had been stabbed in the back by a power they hoped might remain neutral, and now their forces faced enemies on 2 fronts, with no possibility of victory, no hope of relief, and no option but to fight on for honor alone. September 17th also marked the moment when many Polish commanders realized that their strategic situation had become impossible, that holding territory was no longer feasible, and that the only realistic goal was to preserve as many Polish forces as possible for future resistance, either by breaking through to Romania and Hungary, where they might be interned, and later escape to continue the fight from France and Britain, or by forming partisan groups that would resist occupation. The meeting between German and Soviet forces, which occurred near Brest-Litovsk on September 18th, was captured in photographs that show German and Soviet officers smiling, shaking hands, and reviewing troops together. Images that seem almost incomprehensible given that these same nations would be locked in a death struggle just 2 years later. But in September 1939, they were partners in the dismemberment of Poland, collaborators in what would become one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. The German forces, having achieved most of their operational objectives, were now consolidating control over their designated areas, establishing military administration, beginning the process of identifying and targeting Polish intelligentsia, clergy, and potential resistance leaders, laying the groundwork for what would become the general government, a territory under Nazi control, where Polish people would be subjected to systematic oppression, exploitation, and eventually genocide. The Soviet occupation in the East was no less brutal. NKVD units followed the Red Army, conducting mass arrests of Polish officers, government officials, landowners, and anyone deemed a threat to Soviet control. And these prisoners would later be murdered in places like Katyn Forest, their bodies dumped in mass graves that would remain hidden for years, their fate denied by Soviet propaganda, and only acknowledged decades later when the truth could no longer be suppressed. By September 19th, the Battle of Bzura, which had represented Poland's last major offensive operation, had ended in defeat, with thousands of Polish soldiers killed and tens of thousands more captured or forced to retreat toward Warsaw, hoping to make a final stand in the capital that was already under siege. The Polish Navy, recognizing that defending Polish ports was impossible, had executed Plan Peking before the war even started, evacuating 3 modern destroyers, Błyskawica, Grom, and Burza, to Britain, where they would continue to fight alongside the Royal Navy for the entire war, serving with distinction and becoming symbols of Polish determination to continue the struggle no matter the cost. Polish submarines also managed to escape, with some reaching British ports and others being interned in neutral Sweden. And Polish merchant ships scattered across the world's oceans would eventually contribute to Allied logistics and supply operations. September 20th, the final day of our 10-day journey through Poland's agony, found Warsaw completely encircled, cut off from any hope of relief, subjected to constant bombardment from air and ground, running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, yet still defiant, still fighting, still refusing to surrender despite the impossible odds. General Julius Rommel's forces, retreating from the Battle of Bzura, attempted to fight their way into Warsaw to reinforce the garrison, but were blocked by German forces and ultimately forced to surrender after running out of ammunition and options. The city of Lwów, in eastern Poland, faced a similar fate. Defended by Polish forces that had fought off German attacks, it now found itself confronted by Soviet troops demanding surrender. And after several days of fighting against the Red Army, with no hope of relief and no possibility of victory, it, too, would fall. The fortress city of Modlin, north of Warsaw, continued to hold out under intense bombardment, its garrison refusing German surrender demands and preparing for a fight to the death, exemplifying the spirit of resistance that characterized Polish forces throughout the campaign, even when the strategic situation was hopeless. These 10 days, from September 11th to September 20th, 1939, witnessed the transformation of the Second World War from a Polish-German conflict into a broader European war, saw the introduction of blitzkrieg tactics that would terrorize Europe for years to come, exposed the weakness and hesitation of France and Britain, despite their declarations of war, revealed the cynical partnership between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia that shocked the world and demonstrated that ideology meant nothing compared to power politics, and above all, documented the extraordinary courage and sacrifice of Polish soldiers and civilians who fought against overwhelming odds, knowing that defeat was almost certain, but refusing to surrender their honor or their hope for eventual liberation. The Polish government in exile would soon establish itself in France and later in London, maintaining the legal continuity of the Polish state and providing leadership for Polish forces that would fight on every front of the war. Polish pilots would distinguish themselves in the Battle of Britain, shooting down more German aircraft per capita than any other Allied Air Force contingent. Polish soldiers would fight at Narvik, Tobruk, Monte Cassino, and Normandy. Polish codebreakers would provide crucial intelligence that helped crack German Enigma codes, and the Polish underground state would become the most effective resistance organization in occupied Europe, providing intelligence to the Allies, conducting sabotage operations against German forces, and maintaining a shadow government that kept alive the flame of Polish independence through the darkest years of occupation. Warsaw itself would not surrender until September 28th, after enduring bombardment that killed tens of thousands of civilians. destroyed much of the city's infrastructure, and created humanitarian conditions so terrible that the garrison finally accepted terms to prevent complete annihilation of the civilian population. But even in surrender, the defenders of Warsaw demonstrated that Polish resistance was not broken, merely postponed, and that the fight for freedom would continue until final victory was achieved. The September Campaign, as Poles call it, or the invasion of Poland as it's known in the West, lasted only 35 days from start to finish. But those 35 days, and especially the crucial 10 days we've examined from September 11th to 20th, established patterns and precedents that would define the entire Second World War. The targeting of civilians, the use of terror as a military tool, the combination of armor and air power to achieve rapid breakthrough and encirclement, the importance of maintaining offensive initiative, the catastrophic consequences of diplomatic naivety and misplaced trust, and most importantly, the demonstration that even the most advanced military technology and overwhelming numbers cannot break the human spirit when that spirit is committed to freedom and willing to sacrifice everything in its defense. Poland lost approximately 66,000 soldiers killed in action during the September campaign, with over 130,000 wounded and some 694,000 captured by German and Soviet forces, while civilian casualties numbered in the tens of thousands immediately and would climb into the millions over the course of the occupation. But these numbers, as staggering as they are, tell only part of the story. They don't capture the personal tragedies of families torn apart, children orphaned, homes destroyed, dreams shattered, and lives forever altered by those terrible September days when the world went mad and humanity descended into the abyss of total war. The images that survive from those 10 days, Polish cavalry units making desperate charges against German armor, not because they thought horses could defeat tanks, but because they had no other weapons available and refused to surrender without a fight. Civilians digging through rubble searching for loved ones after German bombing raids. Long columns of refugees trudging along roads trying to escape the fighting only to be strafed by German aircraft. Polish soldiers surrendering with tears streaming down their faces, not from cowardice, but from the unbearable pain of defeat, despite their courage and sacrifice. These images haunt us, still, reminding us of the cost of appeasement, the danger of dictators, the consequences of military unpreparedness, and the absolute necessity of standing firm against aggression before it becomes unstoppable. As September 20th, 1939 drew to a close, Poland's military resistance was collapsing, but her spirit remained unbroken. Warsaw still fought on. Scattered units continued to resist in forests and marshes. And the seeds of the resistance movement that would plague the occupiers for the next 6 years were already being planted in the hearts of millions of Poles who vowed that their nation would rise again, that the occupation would not last forever, that justice would ultimately prevail, and that the sacrifice of September 1939 would not be forgotten or wasted. The next 10 days, from September 11th to 20th, 1939, did indeed escalate the war, transforming it from Hitler's gamble into a global catastrophe. But they also established something else. They proved that some values are worth fighting for even when victory seems impossible, that national honor and human dignity cannot be crushed by military defeat, and that the long arc of history, however dark the present moment, ultimately bends toward justice for those brave enough to keep fighting, keep believing, and keep hoping until the dawn finally breaks and freedom is restored.